I'm not sure I belong on this stage today, however. Despite everything I just told you about my professional background, I would argue that I'm not qualified. And in fact, there's something pretty askew to having me here talking and being an authority, supposed, on youth voice, particularly those of disadvantaged youth. The reasons are somewhat self-evident. First, I'm older, maybe old, we could call. I'm 40. Hated hitting that milestone, but 40's the new 20, I'm liking to believe. Okay, thank you. All right, yeah. Secondly, I'm quite privileged. I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, a postcard town. I had access to the best universities and colleges, and have a network of colleagues and friends now who have leadership positions in some of the leading organizations around the country. I'm used to having my voice heard. And the times that I have not had my voice heard, largely because of my gender, actually stick out very prominently in my memory. I don't think many disadvantaged youth can say that. Inherently connected to the privilege is the fact that I'm white. And in this country, that affords me a number of unearned privileges and opportunities. And today, I was most certainly not elected by the at-risk youth of America to represent them here today. I would not be the choice. Given that the majority of youth living in poverty actually routinely have their sense of agency negated or challenged, I would argue that me being on this stage is actually one example of the way in which we tend to appoint people to speak on behalf of others rather than let them speak for themselves. Despite what you think about our missions and our intentions and our organizations, the fact is we do not do a good enough job listening to the people that we are trying to serve and incorporating their voices in our work. We don't listen to them and we don't incorporate them effectively in the design of our programs. We don't incorporate them into the assessment of our programs as effectively as we could. And I think we actually miss a giant opportunity to get routine feedback from them and check in with them about what's working and not working as we go along. Often we'll do a focus group and we'll say, well, we talked to a few kids, we talked to those few, or we'll pick those favorites, the ones who show up to everything, and we'll ask them. But how often do we actually systematically go out and try and collect feedback from everybody, particularly those who don't show up every day, and get their opinions into the service delivery or into the program design? Not that often. I don't think we listen systematically enough, rigorously enough, and we aren't in a position to adequately respond to the data when we get it. Now, I don't think this is organizations' fault. I actually think a lot of this is systemic, and I don't think there are incentives built in. And as we heard earlier this morning, I don't think that, and I will acknowledge having worked with a number of funders, but I don't think the funders also provide support for collecting this kind of data. But the fact is we need to do a better job, and we need to listen. Now, why aren't we listening? Well, there's a whole host of reasons when it comes to beneficiaries generally, but with youth, I think there's a couple of biases that come straight to mind. We tend to think that youth, for example, don't know what's good for them. So we tend to dismiss their perspectives. We tend to think that we don't trust their observations because we think that probably they're going to be motivated by what's fun or what's going to give them immediate gratification. And we think that they maybe don't get the full context. The other thing is to listen is really scary, actually. What if you find out that the program you just spent a year designing actually isn't working, and that the assumptions you made about this youth experience actually are not happening? Well, that is anxiety producing. That is troubling. That is hard to hear. And frankly, if you're going to respond to that, it creates a hell of a lot more work for you as an organization. But I'm here to argue that we have to start to listen, and we have to start to listen for three primary reasons. First, it's the right thing to do. To treat someone with dignity is to assume that they have a level of decision-making power and autonomy about their future. Most of us want to empower youth as a fundamental outcome of our program. How can we say that we are authentically doing that if we don't provide youth with an opportunity to provide feedback and we don't solicit, listen, and respond to what they have to say? Secondly, I would argue it's the smart thing to do. All those biases that people have about youth, I would say from my experience, they're largely unfounded. Youth notice things that we don't always give them credit for, and they see things as program participants that we don't as program creators. And my experience in the education realm, I will tell you that students know exactly what it means to be a good teacher, and they know exactly what it means to attend a good school. Now, they have to be given opportunities to provide that feedback in a constructive, relevant way, but when they do, I will tell you they are spot on. Let me give you one example. There was a school that we worked with with Youth Truth for 3 years, and the first year, they were based in Atlanta, and the first year that we worked with them, they got terrible results, terrible, across the board. Students had negative perceptions of the culture of the school, of the rigor of classes. We survey about their English and math classes, and of the relationships that they had with adults in the building. There's a question on the Youth Truth survey that asks, is there one adult in the building that you could go to with a personal problem? And on that question, the school was rated in the 37th percentile of all schools surveyed around the country. The perceptions of the rigor of the coursework was rated similarly in the bottom quartile of all schools surveyed nationwide. The school had thought they were kind of on the right track. They knew there were some problem points, but I think, frankly, they thought they weren't as visible to the kids. And they thought, well, we've got a few issues, but the kids aren't really, it's not affecting them. And they were working really hard to make things better at this school. And they actually thought their English and math departments were among their strongest. So getting this data was incredibly disheartening and really hard to receive. But what the school did was they used the data to ground a series of conversations. They talked about the fact of what missteps they'd made that had maybe contributed to this culture in this school. They talked about the sacrifices they were going to have to make as a team to have the kind of culture they wanted, and they laid out a shared vision. They realized that the curriculum needed to change, but they also realized that the adult culture in the building needed to change, and that there were elements of toxicity in that culture, and that they needed to address those because they'd trickled down to the student culture. They involved the students in the process. They continued to get feedback from them throughout this, and then the next year they surveyed the youth again. This time, the youth were much more affirmative about their experience. When asked whether there was that one adult that they could go to with a personal problem, the students rated the school in the 77th percentile. And the rigor of the coursework, the perceptions of the rigor of the coursework, the school went from the bottom quartile to the top quartile of all schools surveyed nationwide. What this data allowed them to do, it was not the panacea, but what it allowed them to do was to ground a series of conversations that needed to happen and to have them in a different way, and one that kept the youth at the center of the conversation. Finally, I would argue that getting feedback is important because it's the relevant thing to do. Times are changing, and as we've heard about, technology is changing. And I fear that if we as a sector, not just a youth serving sector, but as a nonprofit sector, if we don't start to listen, I fear that we are going to become the kind of rotary phone analog, the big clunky phone to the digital smartphone. What do I mean by that? Youth today have innumerable channels to communicate their opinions about virtually everything. They Snapchat, they tweet, they Facebook. They can put their opinions out about whatever they want. Even low-income youth, the Pew Research Center says that the majority of low-income children have mobile access to the internet in some way now. It's ubiquitous. And I believe that it is changing expectations of what youth feel about their need to be heard, and that they're getting used to being heard, and they're going to have only growing expectations about having their voice heard. Perhaps the most poignant example of the power of what technology can do is the Arab Spring in 2010. However flawed and compromised that ended up being, what I think the Arab Spring showed was the power that can happen when youth voices come together, their experiences come together through social media, and then they're able to leverage that for collective action. On a more kind of mundane example, some people may be familiar with a company called Reddit, based out in California. Reddit is a moderator of user-generated content. What I mean by that is think of almost the bulletin boards that we all had when the internet was starting. It's kind of that on an incredibly large macro scale. Well, just last month, Reddit fired a very popular moderator on their site, someone who was loved by their user base. The user response was vehement. They went nuts. They effectively shut down the site by stopping participating in conversations. They filed a petition garnering 200,000 signatures in a matter of days, and within 7 days, the CEO of the company was fired. That is an extreme example of what user feedback can do. But more and more, I would argue that companies are issuing large-scale apologies and actually changing product direction based on user feedback. Because users now can not only just express their discontent, but they can actually influence how other people think about an organization and a company. What kind of sector are we going to have if a young person can actually go and make comments and provide commentary and feedback on their iPhone that leads to product change, but they can't provide feedback about the service organization that's actually taken seriously? It's time for us as a sector to change and evolve with the times. So I encourage us to take this opportunity and think about how we can evolve and change. Thank you.